Start. Tell us about yourself. What's your name? What year were you born, and where in Sandwich were you born?
Johnathan Alan Shaw, and I was born actually in the Hyannis Hospital, but of course I came right back home to 3 Jarvis Street, which is where my mother and father lived.
Now I understand that that's a pretty historic home, and it's one of the unique homes on Jarvis Street. Can you tell us about the house itself and the history behind it?
Sure. It was built in 1857, and for my great-grandmother and her first husband, who was John Jarvis, the son of the owner of the glass factory. And it was actually, the money for it was a wedding present from Deming Jarvis, the manager and really part owner of the glass factory.
And you've taken great pride in that. I know you've had it submitted for application someplace. Tell us about that.
That's right. About 10 years ago, I thought it'd be interesting to write up all the information that I had, because you accumulate things in the attic, information like that, and of course there are information that came down from my mother and so forth. So yes, it's on the National Register of Historic Places, and I had the fun of drawing up the application and getting support from the Sandwich Historical Commission for it. And I was able, my son had done some research, and we found out how much it cost originally. And it was $7,181.01, which was a huge sum of money in 1857. And according to the papers, it was the most elegant house ever constructed on Cape Cod. So there are some more elegant houses now, perhaps. But at the time, it was considered to be quite special.
Well, tell us about the interior as to what it looks like today, some of the original boards and the original kitchen area, or whatever else you want to tell us about.
Well, it's a typical Victorian house. More likely, the design would be something that would occur in a city, because it's symmetrical. Same number of rooms on one side as there are on the other, and so forth. And of course, full of Victorian pendant drops and things like that on the outside. The kitchen has a lot of original sorts of things in it. It's got a great copper wash tub. It's got a brick oven there, and so forth. And of course, you know, you can't preserve all that stuff, but you can preserve those things. Of course, there's an electric stove there now, although when I grew up, it was a kerosene stove, and there was a great 55-gallon kerosene drum on the back porch. And then there was, of course, a kerosene hot water heater and a coal furnace in the basement. So all of those things have to be changed, but you keep the character of the house, and I think that's what's important, and enough to give you the flavor of what it was at an earlier time.
Has it been a labor of love to restore the facility?
When one had enough money, it was the labor of love, and when one didn't have enough money, it was also a labor of love.
Okay. So you grew up in that house, as I understand it, but you didn't spend your entire childhood there because of your dad being in the military. So tell us about your experience about when you first remember growing up here, coming and going, and how you always came back.
Well, until I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I went through the first grade in the Henry T. Wing School. So I was here during that time, which of course was the wartime, from 37, when I was born, to 44 or so. So, I have some interesting sort of memories of that time. During the war, of course, one had a victory garden, which is what my mother had. And I had, of course, a victory garden too, with radishes. They come up fast. and they're very satisfying for a kid. And you can eat them too, and they got a little bit of a tang, so it tells you you've really, made something. And in the first grade, when I was in the first grade at the Henry T. Wing School, I had a good friend whose name was Buzzy Masaski, and he and I collected tinfoil from cigarettes to make it into a great ball of aluminum that was going to be recycled for the war effort. So we kept collecting this, and we finally created what, in my imagination, was something the size of maybe a grapefruit. I don't think it was quite that size, but when you're small, it might have seemed that size. In any case, we finally took it, and it was accepted, and and of course you'd be, talking to relatives who were smoking and make sure that you got the wrapping paper. You had to separate it carefully from the paper backing, and then assemble it into this round ball of aluminum. So that was, this was a serious effort on behalf of the war.
Do you remember where you took it?
I don't have any remembrance of that. I just remember this accumulation process was very complex for a 6-year-old, 7-year-old.
And what did your Jarvis Street look like back in the 40s and 50s? What recollections do you have of the stores, the neighbors, the activity in that area of town?
I think the business hub of the town, if you can call it a hub, was about 300 or 400 feet down the street from where I lived. It's now an apartment block on both floors, first floor and second floor. But at that time, it contained the drugstore, it contained the grocery store, it contained a barber shop, and it contained the post office. So there were 4 enterprises in that place. And that's, of course, where I had got my first haircut from L.C. Fournier, who ran the barber shop. And then one would go to the grocery store, and the grocery store was, nobody would even think of having a grocery store that size now. I mean, it isn't even the size of one of these convenience stores. It was much smaller than that, but it had everything that one needed.
What was the name of that? Is that Russell's?
No, it was, I think Alfred Hoy was the owner of it. I'm not sure. It might have been A&P or something like that. I'm not sure about that, the name. That's not the sort of thing that a kid would remember. But I know Mr. Hoy, the selectman, was, I believe, the owner of that place.
And how about the library? Did you find yourself as a little kid going over there very often?
Yeah, I would go to the library. There were 2 librarians. There was to get into the stacks, one had to go through the swinging door, and really no one was supposed to go into there. Later on, I knew that there were some books there that children weren't supposed to read. But I didn't even ask for them. But I understood there were some books there like that. Books like The Scarlet Letter, which later on when I was teaching, and that was, that would be when I was maybe 25, the head of the English department said, because I was teaching English, said that because it was about adultery, he didn't think that teenagers should read it. So if one want to know what the change has been in the last 50 years, to not teach a book that was written in the 40s or 50s, at a time in the 1960s almost, that's quite remarkable.
That is a good example. Talk to me about the time that you spent here, and then you went away from here because your dad being in the military, and then you'd come back in summers and things of that nature.
Yeah, well, as I say, my father was in the military. So after the first grade, I think we went to out to Michigan, and he was commanding officer of an Air Force base out there. He'd been in New Guinea during the war, and in charge of building, basically they were air bases. As soon as the Japanese were pushed out, then he would come in, take the air base, and since he had an engineering background, he leveled it, made it all ready for the planes as they were going along the coast of New Guinea, as they were eventually. So in any case, so we were out there for a while. That must have been the second grade. And then in the Air Force, they're always moving people around. So I think the next year I was in Carver with my grandfather. He had a big place, cranberry bogs and so forth. And incidentally, that was my father's profession before the war. He managed cranberry bogs, and my birth certificate says on it, occupation of father, cranberry man. And so that gives a little sort of insight into that. So after that, out there, I was in, I think, for half a year in the sandwich schools in the third grade. And then we were off again to an air base in Long Island. And so we would be occasionally turning back up here, maybe very briefly. And that was easier, you know, when he was in Selfridge Field on Long Island. But in any case, so I came back, you know, a fair amount of times to see the house. And so it's always been in my background, sort of a base that one radiates out from and then, you know, one springs back to and so forth. And then after the death of my father, why, we lived here for a year, and that was, I guess, the seventh grade that I was in the Henry T. Wing School. And then I went to school up in Belmont area, and then my mother was working at Radcliffe and college in Cambridge, and so I'd come down in the summers. So, and stay with my uncle, who lived across the street. So, and then I would work in the summers, when I got a little bit older, for Crow Farm, Old Man Crowell. And I would hoe in the course of the summer, maybe 5 or 6 miles of turnips and things like that. And I mean, in the course of the summer, it didn't happen very quickly. And then the part of it that I really liked was picking peaches, because if they were really soft, they weren't suitable to sell to anybody, but they were very suitable and very sweet and wonderful to eat. Mm-hmm. So that was a great pleasure.
And do you still have a connection with some of the Crowell family?
I think on our historical commission, Carolyn Crowell is one of our members and was chairman of the Sandwich Historical Commission at one time. So yes, and the Crowells have been wonderful people taking care of that farm for years and years and years. The last memory that I have sort of being an employee there was that the final year, I kept my boots there for whenever I left at the end of the summer. I'd leave my boots there. But the final year I was thinking, I wonder if I really want to go back the following year. So I took my boots and brought them back to the house. And the beginning of the next year, Miss Crowell came and asked me, are you willing to come back again this summer? And I said, well, I thought I decided I really wasn't going to do it. He said, I was afraid of that. I thought that when you took your boots, that meant that you probably weren't coming back.
They read the tea leaves well. Now you were on and off during childhood. You went off to college, made your own way in life, and came back as a retired adult. So give us just a quick synopsis of that.
Well, as I say, I'd spent a lot of summers here. And when I was working down in Florida, which I was doing and running a botanical garden down there, and of course before that I was teaching in a number of different schools. And before that maybe running a botanical garden out in Framingham, the New England Wildflower Society's Garden in the Woods. But when I came back, I thought it would enjoy being back in Sandwich. I've always felt that was the thing that tugged me back, and back to the house there. And over the years, I'd planted a lot of the plants there. This passion for plants has been something sort of in my mind for a long time, and the history of the house. So plants and the history of the house, those are the things that sort of, give me great pleasure. So any case, came back here then, and in my retirement, I decided it was a good idea to retire. I tried it a little early. There's nothing like a double bypass on one's heart to sharpen the perceptions as to what maybe you ought to do. And so that's what I did. Came back and began to take care of the house. And we had to do a few things to, improve it a little bit, get a new furnace in it and all that kind of stuff. And
so you did the reverse of what many people do today. In retirement, you moved from Florida and came back to the Cape instead of the other way around.
That's right. And I had great pleasure in telling some of the people down there, I said, I'm retiring north. And that, of course, kind of startled them that anybody would do that. I actually like the seasons. I prefer to have a season. I prefer to see a little bit of winter. The Cape has mild winters, but it's enough to tell you that it is a winter. And when I was down in Florida, there was a maple tree near my house that I had bought there at the time. I sold it when I left Florida, but that maple tree would drop its leaves in the middle of, it would drop the leaves around the 1st of January, and the new leaves would come out on the 15th of January. And so I always thought that, 2 weeks of winter isn't really enough to give you a chance to be acclimated to the fact that the seasons are returning again.
Well, that story about the tree reminds me of a particularly interesting tree in your own backyard that was planted many years ago. The one from Japan or China, from the Orient, and it has a little bit of a story to that. If you can recollect that, can you tell us about that particular tree?
Sure. Right out the dining room window of the house is a ginkgo tree. And my mother always referred to it as a jingo tree. And I always thought that was a very strange pronunciation. Many years later, I discovered that that was the pronunciation in the 1850s. It was planted probably by John Jarvis, right at the beginning when the house was built in 1857. And his wife's relatives, actually an uncle, was the president of the Massachusetts Horticultural Society and had an enormous nursery, probably the biggest nursery in the Boston area. So I've always thought that that tree was planted probably at the time the house was built, and that it probably came through his wife's connection with this uncle who was president of the Massachusetts Horticultural Society and had a large nursery. In any case, it was probably planted as a small tree in 1857 or 8, and it's about 4 feet in diameter now. That's the trunk, and maybe about 80 or 90 feet high. And the interesting feature of the tree is that it's probably the oldest fossil trees. That species of tree is the oldest fossil trees in the world. They existed at the time of the dinosaurs. And so it's a fascinating tree. And if one wants to know what country it comes from, one looks at the leaves and they're fan-shaped. So it's, of course, China. and they're greatly admired in China and planted on various special places. So it was probably planted in the location that it was so that a stage could come in, a stagecoach or a wagon, and circle the tree. You could get out, and at that time there was a door in the side of the house with a little arbor, and you could go in to the, probably into the parlor. The parlor being the room on the left where you take the minister, and it's kind of fancy furniture. The other side might be where everybody else stays during the day, but when you really want something fancy and something that you keep kids out of in the Victorian period, it would have been the parlor. And this would have gone from that ginkgo tree up into the parlor.
Now, you have a surprisingly large lot of land behind your house that really spreads out quite a distance. So tell us about that and about the tidal effect that has on the rear of your property on heavy rains, and what it's like back there. How many acres?
Well, the original property that John Jarvis had, at least the records that I've looked at, he had about 6 acres. But the land that came to my mother and before my mother and father was about 1.5 acres. Well, 1.15 acres, 1 and 6 acres. And that was the lot that the house was on. So he must have had more land at that time, Jarvis did. During the Second World War, my mother was able to acquire, because my father really wanted her to buy it if she could do it, about an acre or an acre and a half behind the house, which is sort of a little bit of upland and then a lot of marsh. And so she acquired it, I believe, just about at the beginning of the war from the Daniel Webster Inn. And it didn't cost very much. And it permitted her to have her victory garden out there. And Henry Cook came with his tractor and plowed the land so that my mother could have her victory garden, and I could have my little victory garden radish patch. Then some years later we acquired a little bit more land from the back of a house, about 1/3 of an acre. So maybe there's a total, and a lot of it is marsh, maybe there's 3 acres. But it's unusual to have that much land right in the middle of the town.
Now, your mother was engaged in another real estate transaction. Tell us about the woodlot story.
Well, my mother, and I guess from her father, she had inherited a woodlot. Now, a woodlot is a piece of land that you take the wood off so you can keep the fireplace fires burning. And you get the wood off it, and maybe you take a little bit off every year. It was a 20-acre woodlot. Now, most people in town at one time had woodlots. They were not in the center of town. They were out in the woods. And this particular woodlot was on Popple Bottom Road. And it was about 200 feet wide and half a mile deep. And the reason that they were that size was so that you could get a lot of woodlots on one stretch of road. So that there would be 10, 20, 30, 40 woodlots that might be on a given 1 mile stretch of road. So in any case, she had it. What would happen, of course, given the character of Cape Cod, was that about every 20 years, when it was about ready to be harvested, at least if one were going to harvest it for lumber, there'd be a fire that would go through and would burn it all up. Because fires were very common on the Cape, even up into the 1950s. I can remember some of these serious fires that swept across parts of the Cape. Any case, when my father died, we moved back to Sandwich, as I mentioned earlier. And he had died in a plane crash, and he was in the Air Force. And we came back, and after we were there about maybe 3 or 4 months, the town clerk of Sandwich, Channing Hoxie, came to my mother and said, Mary, I understand you have a woodlot. Well, of course, being the town clerk, it wasn't a matter of understanding. He knew damn well that she had a woodlot. But he was actually a pretty neat guy. And I think he'd begun to think about getting land for conservation. I really don't know. I don't think it was so much speculation as maybe thinking about it in larger purposes. In any case, he came to her and he said, Mary, have you ever thought of selling that land? She said, no, I hadn't really thought about it. But are you interested in it? Is that it? Well, he said, yes, I am. You know, land around here, Mary, goes for $1 an acre. And, but I'd very much like to offer you $2 an acre. And to round it out, I'd offer you $50 for your 20 acres. And she said, well, I appreciate your interest in this. Now, I was about 11 years old and beginning to be conscious of numbers and things like that. And of course, I found this a fascinating conversation. So I remembered it all these years. And I listened very carefully. I didn't say anything. And finally she said, well, I appreciate your interest in this, but I don't think I'll do it now. Now, later on, I found that probably land generally hadn't sold for $1 an acre since the Revolution. On the other hand, it was a serious offer to offer $2 an acre on land that was absolutely worthless in 1950 or so. I mean, nobody had real interest in it. So it was a serious offer. Later on, I'm going to say a few years later, maybe she sold it for $400 or $500. And her income that year, because she was working up, or maybe it was the next year, she was working up for Radcliffe in the student employment there. And maybe her salary was $1,800, something like that. So if it had been a $200 or $300 or $400 offer, which would have been what? That would be maybe $10 an acre or $15 an acre. I think she would have done it right away.
Now, the Hoxie name is familiar to all of us for no other reason than we have the Hoxie House in town, which brings me into some of the historical buildings in town. In your recollections of what conditions they were in and what happened in the 1960s to make them what they are today?
Well, in 1960, which is when I think approximately the Hoxie House and the Dexter Gristmill were fixed up, the town decided that these historic properties should be dealt with. They owned them, they had acquired them for one means or another. I'm not sure about the Dexter Gristmill, but certainly the Hoxie House had been, I think, acquired through taxes or something like that, and certainly not for very much. So the town rather wisely decided that they wanted to fix them up, that would be an asset for the town, so they did. And those came out of, that was done by tax revenue.